Buenos dias, bon dia, good morning to everybody. Welcome to our daily webinars, a space for us to bring brilliant minds and new information for all of us to be enlightened, to be entertained, to be educated, to be informed, so that we can take better decisions during this time. I'm Claudia Romo Edelman, and this is part of the Hispanic Response and Recovery Plan. And every day we bring you someone to talk about something. And today I'm delighted to welcome Vivian Nunez, who's a writer and the founder of Too Damn Good, Too Damn Young, and Too Damn Good too, I hope. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And today we invited Vivian Nunez, who's again a writer and the founder of Too Damn Young, for an important discussion around mental health. We've heard so much from everybody how this is taking a toll for all of us. Not only at the personal level, domestic violence is increasing, and we need to understand and get to hear about the resources. So mental health, particularly within communities of colors and millennial Gen Z. Additionally, we will discuss the mental and emotional impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, the physical toll, and the ways in which we can support our mental health during these trying times. Vivian, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you for that great introduction. And I think for just framing up that conversation in such an important way.
Vivian, what we know is we're bringing this and we're doing these webinars. We're doing all of what we're doing because we know how disproportionately affected the Hispanic community is and how little we know that we're disproportionately affected. We're affected at the health level, at the economic level. We're disproportionately exposed, and we're not disproportionately helped. We're not disproportionately supported. We're not disproportionately addressed. We know that 117 brands have been turning around their communication, and instead of selling product, they're talking about COVID in different ways, but only 13 of those are talking to the Hispanic community. And it is very, very important. And I think that is very scary for us to see that according to the data of CM Plus, 44% of Hispanics are in denial of the psychological impact of COVID-19. So we welcome you today, and we would love to talk a little bit about how, like the context overall about Latinx and mental health. How are we navigating the emotional stress of caring for our family in this particular time for Hispanics, particularly since we're far away sometimes from our family. So talk to us a little bit about like mental health, how to navigate it in COVID-19. What what are the implications that you see for the Hispanic community? What should we know?
I think that one of the important things that you hit on already is just that this is impacting us across the board in very large ways, right? So socioeconomically, it is definitely taking a toll. But then if we really narrow that in down to the individual level, it doesn't take much to understand how much our communities are being impacted, right? Because sometimes we get lost in the narrative of our communities and it feels so large, and that means it sometimes feels so distant. Like I've been calling my uncle daily, right, who lives maybe 7 miles away from where I live in uptown New York, where disproportionately that community and communities in the Bronx and other boroughs are being impacted just by COVID in general for all the reasons he listed. And it doesn't go a day without someone who we know family wise, either a second cousin or someone who lives in the same street that I grew up on, has passed away as a result of COVID. And that's when it becomes way more real, right? That's when the impact of it becomes less of a theoretical, this will definitely impact us in the long run, to this is impacting us and shaping us right now. Ultimately, for my family specifically, I can tell you that the thing that shifted my my family's perspective on how they were treating and navigating COVID as a whole was the reality of seeing other people around them die. It was like, it's not just happening on TV anymore. And the mental health implications of that are real, right? Because we're not only facing grief as a communal experience, but we're also being faced with the grief of individual loss and of fearing for our own lives, right? Mortality is being challenged in really large ways. And when we think about that, I can 100% see how that statistic holds true of so many Latinos being in denial of the mental health impacts, because on a regular day, we don't have open conversations around mental health, right? We don't have the basis on which this is a conversation we're having normally and openly. Instead, it's one that is usually hidden. Latina teenage girls are usually the most impacted when it comes to suicide rates, right? Those are the highest numbers because we're not having those conversations within the groups that we should be having them. And so a lot of what has to happen systemically is shifting the conversation to make it more acceptable and more agreeable. And it happens one-on-one, right? We can have these systemic changes that have organizations championing our communities and putting the information out there. But the difference between whether someone is actually going to take that information or whether they're not usually comes down to how they are talking about it in their families, with their friends, among the people they know. So one of the things that I've been doing to try to help my family understand that this is both very real, but also something that there are resources for, is sending them over myself, right? I feel like this generation, the millennial generation, is that connecting bridge more than ever as a first generation American, to connect that bridge between my family members and the resources out there, and making sure that they understand that there are resources for them in Spanish, that there are ones that are culturally sensitive to the realities of what everyone is going through in these communities right now. And that the more that we are able to connect those dots for them, the easier it is to just even have them look at it for 5 minutes. Because sometimes that's all it takes. It's 5 minutes of awareness that makes you feel a little bit less alone in whatever conversation you're having.
I actually want to understand that a little better. And I do want to talk to you, and I want to share with you, my own story, which is something that I've shared on social media. My mother has been for 7 weeks in the hospital, 5 of them in intensive care with a ventilator and on the, like on the head, on the edge of death. Um, and it has taken a toll. And I took off probably 1 week, like 10 days, to make sure that I was able to get this drug that was unavailable in Mexico. And I was in New York and she was in Mexico. And I literally obsessed with trying to get this remdesivir drug, and wrote every single letter. And I was really like, I called the person that knew that person that knew that person. And literally, it took over my life for a number of days. But beyond that, then I came back to work normal. And a lot of people are, like asking, like, how are you? Like, how are you really? Because you're like holding these webinars and you're talking to different people. And I want to understand what you said about millennials, because in my case, what happened was that my daughter was like, she learned something in school about how important it was to have a place that she called a safe space,
Mm-hmm.
and where we could have those letting go, and just like crying and being upset and just like literally, like venting. Um, and she was the one who said, like, you're never gonna be able to hold it all on your own and just like continue as a warrior, although that's the Latina image that I was taught to be, unless you have a safe space. So why don't we create it? So we created this Google Hangout where all my family comes for 15 minutes every day, and pretty much everybody either prays or cries or both, or laughs or remembers or something like that. But it was her idea, pretty much, that one, we have to have a safe space, and two, it is important to be vulnerable. And it's not only important to be vulnerable for me, but it's important to be vulnerable so that she can see that it's important, that it's okay to be vulnerable.
I love that story. I think that it is the perfect example of exactly what I was saying. I think that millennials, Gen Z, are in a lot of ways way more open to having those conversations, right? Because they are growing up within it, right? Social media has made it a lot more normal to have these open conversations. And they are really plugging in at this point in time as a generational gap, as this is what is happening, and it isn't just affecting our physical health, and it is affecting the mental health of those around you, right? I lost my grandmother almost 7 years ago, and we were in and out of ICU for 5 months. She was on a ventilator. I made end of life decisions for her, and I was 21 years old, and I remember vividly how overwhelming that felt, because in a lot of ways, because I grew up first generation, I was kind of split between these two mentalities, exactly like your daughter was telling you. It was being raised as having to be this strong Latina woman who just takes it all in and carries it all and makes the decisions, But then also I was growing up in a very American culture that encouraged me to step into my feelings a little bit more, or that questioned why I wasn't being supported in specific ways. And I think as more and more people have these realities and come to head with what mortality looks like and what taking care of your family looks like, it has to go back to being able to take care of yourself as well and create those safe spaces, right? And it's wonderful to see how the breadth of those safe spaces can move, right? It can be a Google Hangout. It can be 5 minutes by yourself sitting in the bathroom with no one else and just crying. It can be anything that allows you to have feelings bubble up that you can't have bubble up in the middle of a work thing, and that you can't have bubble up in the middle of any other conversation. But it's having those examples to actually look at and point to that makes it easier for the next person. You know, when I started Too Damn Young, I was probably one of the very few people in this space who was talking openly about young adults who were grieving and what that grief experience was actually like. And the more and more I saw that I was talking about it, other people wanted to talk about it. And it's going to be the same thing with coronavirus and the impact of COVID-19. Right now, we're in like a physical health crisis. It's trying to make sure that we are physically healthy. And what that looks like is making sure we're in isolation, making sure we're staying home and washing our hands and doing all the things that come with it. But at the end of the physical health, whenever that feels like safe in some shape, way, or form, and even simultaneously as it becomes more safe physically, we're 100% in the middle of a mental health crisis. And those same populations that have been underserved in terms of physical health are incredibly underserved when it comes to mental health. I did not know about anything mental health related until I was in college. And it was very much in the middle of taking care of my grandmother that I realized that I was having anxiety and all the things that I was experiencing were not in any way, shape, or form healthy, and that it was silently killing me even if it wasn't physical. And so I think that making sure that our organizations and our communities and the leaders within those spaces are actively having vulnerable conversations about what it's like for you really makes a difference. Even you sharing it during this webinar, I'm so thankful for that, because there are so many people who probably look up to you and maybe didn't know the back end of what you're dealing with on your personal. And bringing that all together, like that's something I've been saying often right now, is this quarantine has forced us to bring everything home. Like every single part of us is at home now. We share the same address. Therapy is in the same place. Religion is in the same place. Everything that we have ever done in our lives. And I think it's making us show more and more that we are a full human instead of these parts that we show in different areas.
That we're all human. And I'm super interested. So we have what's some advice for some people that is first encountering with grief, and how do you recognize actually that you said it, you started recognizing with your grandmother that you were feeling something. I think that a lot of it is you don't even know what you're going through that is a mental health issue until it's like really severe. So give us advice and give us hints about how to recognize what to do. There's no one can tell me that they don't have a hit at the mental health level from this one. Even if you have every person that you know is healthy and so on, I would like this is really hard. So some advice, some hints. How do we recognize it? How do we deal with it?
Yeah, like when I was with my grandmother in the hospital, it was very hard because I'd grown up with the perspective and the mentality that we were supposed to just be strong. And so that what I was feeling wasn't normal from this perspective of this is fine. Everyone else feels like it's really hard to get through the day. So obviously it's okay to feel like this. And when you define normal as pain, it's really hard to figure out what is a red flag and what isn't. So for me, it really took having multiple anxiety attacks to realize I probably needed more help than I was getting by myself. And so I started going to therapy. And she was the first person who validated how much I was actually carrying. Because sometimes that's what you need, whether it's a therapist or a friend to tell you, actually, you're carrying a lot. Like that is heavy. And even if you don't personally internalize it as such in that moment, it is a very big truth. And for those who are grieving for the first time, I think that this is such a uniquely sad way to kind of start that journey with grief. Because a lot of the traditional social cues that we have, which is like funerals and going to places and supporting someone in those spaces, we don't have them right now. So we're not queued up to feel XYZ way because we don't have the actual settings to do it. So it goes back to making sure that we're creating those spaces like you talked about before, like those safe spaces to have those feelings. If you have lost someone or if you are losing someone, it is how do I make sure that I'm making space for something that is like a virtual funeral or a virtual connection point with my family if we are coping with this loss together, even if we can't be physically together. And for those who are navigating family and friends in hospitals or just in general navigating the solitude of experiencing this alone in their own homes, it's about finding ways to have daily check-ins with yourself and figuring out and reminding yourself that right now, especially, there's so little that we can control, but what we can control is how we react to things and ourselves and how we take care of ourselves and whether we have healthy coping mechanisms to do so. You know, everything from journaling to yoga, if you have the energy for it, to writing to calling a friend. Everything will help and add up over time.
But Vivian, I do want to ask you about like how is that for people of color, particularly for Hispanics? I'm very clear, for example, that I grew up with that entrenched feeling of like, suck it up, you know, like chin
Mm-hmm.
up, keep walking, or hard, you know, work hard. I can also like even listen to the woman of my family say like, just keep hard work. It keep you further. Will give you everywhere. So I just I want to know about like how is this specific to Hispanics, and is it good or bad to recognize that you're feeling one way or the other, or do we bring the hard work and let's chin up and go on, which is also a mechanism to cope, right?
100%. I think that there are times where the best thing that will help you is figuring out how to keep on going because sitting down will make it worse sometimes, right? And you want to make sure that the whole key about it is awareness, is understanding that you are feeling a specific way and what is the proper path to get you to a place where you feel safe and healthy in that moment enough to be able to cope with the bigger feelings that you may be feeling, right? Like there are moments where I have a bunch of anxiety, but I also know that I have to get through certain things at work. And I tell myself, like, I do not have the time right now to break down. I just can't. So what am I going to do to get myself to a place where I feel good and healthy? And then later on, give myself the space to process those feelings in whatever shape or form. But this is also coming from a place of I'm speaking to the people who have a little bit more of an understanding and an okay feeling with feeling their feelings. A lot of Latinos don't. You know, like you were saying before, a lot of it isn't just here's this thing, do it. It's how do I actually get you to do this thing that's going to help you? And I'm realizing that a lot of that, I mean, it comes down to tricking our family. It really does. It comes down to saying and being honest with, I can't tell you to meditate if you've never ever tried meditating before. And if you are not open to that conversation. So instead, what are the things that I can do that can help you find some peace of mind that will baby step you into larger conversations? So I've been encouraging my uncles with everything from, hey, you should do a puzzle, to like maybe take a longer walk with the dog, to finding those little pockets of space and understanding that mental health doesn't have to look just like only like therapy or only like meditation or only like things of that sort. It can be anything that gives you that little bit of that breathing and reprieve in that time. And we have to be okay with the understanding that it's not a one size fits all. And that circumstantially, especially with our communities of color, it's going to look different. It can't be, you know, when they are not as receptive to here is like a meditation app, go ahead and do it. So how can I meet you where you are so that you can get the help that you need, not by way of what I think is right, but by way of what is actually going to help you?
It is super important. I do want to make sure that we we get it clear. So we have to proactively look for those things that makes us breathe
Yeah.
and safe and be, like, and it's super important that we do recognize that there's something and we have to address it. And like knowing that sometimes it's okay to just like chin up and keep going, but
Mhm.
it is important to have those spaces and not completely cover it up como la olla express de los frijoles, otherwise it's going to flow, right? So
Exactly.
is that what you said?
Yeah. And
And
I think
yeah, yeah,
that
go.
that ends up being the most helpful piece of advice particularly to give to someone who is being that generational gap, like we were talking about before, like the millennial or the Gen Zer who is helping their parents cope with this time, or their grandparents, and navigating how to help their family. It's understanding that this is not one size fits all, that what works for you from a perspective of being really open to meditation or to therapy may not be the solution for them in that moment, even if you want it to be. That it's okay if what you're offering up is, hey, just have some self-awareness, you're not feeling well, maybe do something that makes you feel good and makes you feel better and is healthy. And having that barometer for it makes a difference, right? It's also understanding that little things do make a difference, especially during this time. And the more that we can have those one-on-one conversations and have them be as honest and as real as we possibly can, the more that that larger conversation around mental health will begin to shift.
I do want to bring one point that someone, Kelly Pengeli, is bringing here. We normally don't take questions, but I think that this is really relevant. But the reason why I have a safe space is because my daughter heard that from school. Someone told her this time it's important to create that space. She brought it to our family. I have 30 members of our family that meet every day at 2 o'clock Mexico time, 3 o'clock New York time for 15 minutes. And that has been the case for 5 weeks, pretty much, or 4 weeks or something. So the role of educators is incredible in bringing that awareness and that space. So the question of Kelly is, how can educators, higher ed or K-12, create virtual support to help Hispanic students, faculty, staff impacted most especially if those serving them are experiencing the impact differently? That's such a profound question. Thank you, Kelly.
Great question. And I think the best way to start answering it is to say that creating the space and inviting anyone in is the place to start. Actually acknowledging that this is a reality and a problem, and not hiding from the fact that we are being disproportionately impacted, that communities of color are being disproportionately impacted across so many different variables. And the more that we can acknowledge that that even is a reality, it validates the feelings that so many people are probably feeling already, whether it's their fear or their anxiety around how their families are going to be impacted by this. And that is sometimes the open door conversation that someone needs in order to walk in and say, I'm actually feeling so much, and how do I help my family? You know, and having that experience of validation makes such a difference when we're talking about how to connect with those who may not have as open of a conversation around mental health.
Thank you, and I think that Vivian, if you don't mind, if Kelly has any other question, if she can, like email you directly, because I think that that's an important conversation. I want to close by allowing you to share resources, tips, ideas for everyone, but also by asking you, there, like I'm a specialist on war and disaster zone. So my entire life I was doing United Nations work in Sudan or Eritrea, or places of conflict. And there's something that happens to the mind when you move it from fear to action. Your mind gets, when you get busy in doing something that is a plan, you turn around, like I've seen communities that are like hiding from waiting for someone to attack them to building a wall. That's already, like, or building a protection. That's already bringing their mindset into a more positive, to a more positive space. So I'm just curious about what you would have as a closing message on that space of moving from, like of having a plan, having an action, having someone to look forward, moving from fear to hope, and if there's any resources and tips that you would like to give as a closing message.
Of course. So thank you so much for just in general having this conversation. I think it's such a great starting point for really changing the narrative as a whole. And when it comes to understanding both grief and the pain and the anxiety and the mental health struggle of this, is understanding that at the same exact time, there is happiness and there are things to be grateful for and there are things to hold on to. One does not happen immediately after the other. They happen side by side. And the more that we can start to take in those moments, the easier it gets to find them and to hold them and to use them as a resource to navigate the really hard moments, right? I think that so often when we're in the middle of tragedy or when we're in the middle of so much fear, we forget that there are different pockets of time where maybe it wasn't as hard. And so my biggest recommendation is, on a 24-hour day, just write down anytime you think of something happy, anything time you think of something that actually brings you joy or gratitude. because having a physical list to refer to, especially in the moments where you have spiraling thoughts about how hard everything is, that is something you can look at and that is undeniably true because you wrote it down when it happened and it was fact. And then maybe today you'll have less than you did yesterday or more than you did, but the more that you compile these lists, the easier it'll be to turn to the reality and make it a habit, strengthen it as a muscle, that there is good in the world at the same exact time. And that's ultimately why you work through your mental health, right? We navigate our mental health so that we can see more and more of the happiness every single day. And the more awareness we have in dealing with the hard, the easier it is to find the things that help us compensate for that. For other resources, like Claudia mentioned, at twodynamic.com, which is a young adult resource for grieving young adults. We have American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is a great resource in terms of just having general information. NAMI is an awesome one as well. Crisis text line allows you to text anyone who is in a sort of crisis for a mental health reason. Headspace has awesome resources in both English and Spanish for those who are navigating and needing meditation as a form of refuge during this time. There are amazing resources that are both in English and Spanish, which I find really helpful when I'm sending them to my own family and making sure that they feel comfortable from the get when it comes to the info.
We will take all of those resources, take down from Vivian, put them at the hispanicstar.org so that everybody can have access to them. And one last invitation, Vivian, I think that giving is also important because it moves you from, like how sorry I am to, wow, we are all suffering and I can contribute to make it better. So we're kicking off a month of action, the Hispanic Stars in Action, to help Hispanics doing anything, donating, volunteering, sharing information, sharing resources, 21 May. So we'd love to invite you, Vivian, to activate your communities, your networks, your uncle, and everyone to be part of this. This is the time for Hispanics to act for Hispanics and advocate for Hispanics and support Hispanics. And we can do it together, not only helping each other, but also knowing that when you give and when you help, it helps you personally, mentally to be better. So join us, Vivian, for the month of action, kicking off 21 May, and let your communities and your network know. Thank you so, so much, Vivian Nunez, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Valerie. This was an amazing conversation. I'm thankful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.